Welcome. In each region of the province, many sisters and associates currently minister with those who are experiencing homelessness. As SND USA, the Justice, Peace, and Integrity of Creation National Office is supporting a Lenten service opportunity to bring help, healing, and hope to the homeless in each geographical area, as well as sharing this video as an educational resource to provide a closer look at the root causes of the homelessness crisis. We're going to begin our time with prayer, a prayer that all may find a home. By Jane Darren from the Education for Justice, a project of the Ignatian Solidarity Network. Christ, who often did not have a place to lay your head, grant your mercy to all those who are homeless, who need secure housing, who are longing to live in dignity, who need us, their sisters and brothers, so they may know the shelter of community. Christ, whose parents had to search for shelter before and after your birth, help us to understand the root causes of the lack of decent and affordable housing today. Move us to respond to those who still search for a place that will provide grounding, for a place that will be a blessing for them. Christ, who enjoyed the hospitality of many homes, help us to offer hospitality to you in the least of these, by supporting housing programs and projects and local, state, and federal policies that will transform the systems and structures that keep too many out in the cold. Grant us all the warm embrace of a decent home so we all may flourish and build your kingdom. Amen. Homelessness is a global issue. The United Nations calls it a profound assault on dignity, social inclusion, and the right to life. Our own Catholic social teaching has long taught the right to decent housing is a fundamental human right to promote the life and dignity of the human person. The Second Vatican Council said there must be made available to all persons everything necessary for leading a life truly human, such as food, clothing, and decent shelter. Saint Pope John Paul II said, by virtue of their human dignity, all persons must be guaranteed housing, which not only offers physical shelter, but a suitable place for satisfying social, cultural, and spiritual needs. A house is much more than a roof over one's head. It is a place where a person creates and lives his or her life. Homelessness does not affect all people equally. So who are the homeless? About 500,000 people in the United States are homeless. But we need to remember that statistics about the number of homeless are often skewed. It's hard to count people who are not in a fixed location. Also, people who are on the brink of homelessness, who may be living in a motel or staying on someone's couch, do not officially meet the definition of homelessness. Since the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, more and more people are finding themselves just one paycheck away from homelessness. There are 3 levels or categories of homelessness. The first is chronic. This is for people who consider shelters their permanent home rather than just an emergency arrangement. The next is transitional. Transitional homelessness pertains to those who go to shelters for a short period of time before transitioning into a more stable home. And the last type is episodic. People who go in and out of the homeless situation due to personal issues of maybe mental health, unemployment, or addiction. Now, to ask why are they homeless is not an easy answer. Homelessness is not a simple cause and effect relationship. It is usually a combination of factors that are personal and environmental. About half of homeless women and children are fleeing domestic violence. Nearly half of homeless young adults were in foster care at some point in time and have now aged out. Many of the young people who are living on the streets are members of the LGBTQ community and have found themselves kicked out of their family homes. Predominantly, men are the majority of homeless people. But there are many women and children who are also homeless. Many of our services lack a network of support. People are released from a hospital. Often there is no support plan in place. If they've been hospitalized due to an accident or a severe illness or disability, the medical bills can add up at the same time that the person has been unable to work. People who are released from the prison system also often lack support and have a challenging time finding housing and employment. There are also a large number of veterans of the United States military who are homeless. Not only are people with mental illness affected and find themselves in a homeless situation, but also adults who had parents with mental illness or those who are with a spouse or partner with mental illness. The same is true of addiction or substance abuse. Once we learn more about the people who are experiencing homelessness, we are better able to see and support them on our streets, buses, classrooms, libraries, churches, doorways, so that they are no longer invisible and alone. Along with our office's role in education and direct service, we also respond to issues with advocacy efforts. There are currently several pieces of legislation that we are watching for aid with housing and social services, especially Medicare. When we are ready, we will send out a voter voice action alert. Now we will hear from Sister Lisa McGaffin of the Southern California area, who will talk about the homeless situation where she lives and ministers. Sister Rosanna Mellert and Sister Louise Ann Breen of the Chardon, Ohio area will share stories of their ministry, especially through the Labre ministry. Labre is a ministry to those who are homeless, and it is done through high schools where students go out and form relationships with those they meet on the streets, along with helping to provide some basic needs like food and hygiene items.
Chat with you folks about the homeless situation in Southern California. Our most recent estimate is that there are 72,000 homeless individuals in the 3 major counties which comprise Southern California. Now, this is based on the homeless count that happened in 2020. There was no homeless count in 2021 because of the pandemic, and the 2022 homeless count just happened 2 weeks ago. So we'll certainly see an increase in this number of homeless individuals. Now, one of the questions people may ask is, well, exactly who are the homeless? Kind of randomly, they are people suffering from mental illness and addictions. Many of them are veterans. Many of them are people of color, senior citizens, transition age youth. These are the folks who have aged out of the foster care system and maybe do not have the education or the background or the emotional and physical stamina to be out on their own. And also, believe it or not, college students. They are scraping together what money they can to pay their college fees. So it's not unusual to have college students living in their cars. And finally, the formerly incarcerated. Again, this is an example of a population who may not have the skills or the physical and emotional stamina to maintain employment. So what are some of the causes of homelessness? In Southern California, it is first and foremost the high cost of housing. And part of that is related to the fact that there are people who are NIMBYs. They do not want affordable housing in their backyard. They want to maintain their more exclusive residential areas. There's an absence of living wage jobs. If you take a look at what it costs for housing, which would include things like utilities, folks should not have to pay more than about 1/3 of their income for housing. And here in Southern California, it's upwards of 50 to 75%. And so, you know, is it going to be my rent, or is it going to be food, or is it going to be medical care? Also, folks with mental health issues very often fall into the homeless category. They're unable to live within what we call the social structures, whether it's a family, an apartment complex. They just cannot cope with the expectations and the demands of living within a social structure. The deterioration of family life is also huge. I think in some cultures, when people fall on hard times, there's always a relative that will take them in. And we don't necessarily have that anymore in our culture. There's certainly inadequate government funding for what I would call public housing or the Section 8 vouchers. What's being done to help the homeless? It's huge. First of all, there's short-term outreach. But what I read actually this morning in an article in the Los Angeles Times, the answer is permanent housing, not more shelter beds. Shelter beds are just a Band-Aid on this situation. We have nonprofit organizations that are building and managing affordable housing. And I have been privileged to be a board member for many mansions for many years. And that's really part of our mission, to build and manage affordable housing. Affordable housing does not need to look like the tenements that we so often consider the image we have of affordable or low-income housing. Also, nonprofit organizations that not just provide the housing, but the life-enriching services, especially for those who have been homeless, for those who have mental health issues. They need supportive services so that they can stay housed. So it's not just a roof over their heads, it's whatever services they need, the counseling, the connections with other resources in the community, budgeting information, how to find a job, how to keep a job. So those services are really, really important. It's great to see networks of nonprofit organizations addressing the causes of homelessness. We also are finding here in California changes in our zoning laws for increased density for things like what we call granny flats. Actually, the state of California is requiring each city to upgrade what's called the housing element of their general plan to increase the number of units, and especially affordable units. Also, it's exciting to see creative housing alternatives. There's a big movement right now to build modular housing out of shipping containers. And they can be refurbished from, the basic raw shipping container into, a reasonable dwelling place. And the whole other movement is what's called tiny homes. They are very affordable to build. It does not take a lot of time. But again, I'm especially the tiny homes, I don't see them really as a permanent solution to this situation, but at least they would get people off the streets. And we also are seeing a new strategy of mental health workers accompanying the police on an emergency call that entails a possible mental health issue. It's dealing with people who have mental health issues with a lot more respect. And I think this is going to help maybe calm down some of the inflammatory situations that may cause a mental health person to become incarcerated. What can we do? Oh my gosh, first and foremost, we all think about direct service, giving coats to the homeless, providing them with food. That's all very good, but it's not a long-term solution. I'm really going to encourage folks to provide advocacy, especially on the local level. I think writing letters to senators or state politicians, that's good. But I think our local entities need to hear from those who are concerned about the mentally ill. And there's many great ways to do that. And we can also, especially as Sisters of Notre Dame, who have such a great background in education, we know how to be leaders. So that's, I think, a special part of our call to help those on the margins. Some other ideas, we can certainly pray and pray with homeless individuals. It's great to pray for them, but to pray with them as we demonstrate a pastoral care when we encounter a homeless individual. We certainly can become better educated about the situation, and just let me warn you, it's extremely complex, but it's very exciting as well. I think another important strategy we can embrace is partnership. We do not need to reinvent the wheel. We are also not trained social workers. That's a whole other dimension of this situation. But we can get involved in local nonprofit organizations. It's so exciting to see people from different faith communities in these nonprofit organizations. What if every affordable housing nonprofit had a representative from every local Catholic parish on its board or in an active volunteer role? I mean, to me, this is like one of the easiest ways for us to embrace the marginalized, to network, to collaborate, and to bring our best gifts to those in need. So again, I'm so privileged to have been part of an affordable housing nonprofit for many years. And I really look forward to participating in any way I can. I think most of you have my contact information. I also encourage you to take a look at manymansions.org. It's a great organization that will give you ideas that perhaps you could translate into action in your local community. So thank you, and God bless you.
Hey, I'm Sister Rosanna, and I just wanted to share with you some thoughts about some people. We wonder, who are the homeless? I'm going to tell you a few stories. There's one really good friend of mine. His name is Federico. Okay, and he made himself what I call a nutshell on a bridge. And he made it with tarps. And the only way he could get in this nutshell is he has to lay down in there because he can't stand up. It's not high enough. So he goes in, he lays down, and this nutshell even has a sliding door. And so when you go in, you knock on the top of the nutshell, as I call it, in his little hut, and he slides the door and says, "Who's there?" Okay, and then you find out this nice guy who is in there, and I say, "Are you sure you're warm enough?" "Oh yeah, I'm fine in here, no problem." Okay, and so then you look around, and he's got a little radio. Sometimes he asks for batteries for his radio. Okay, and he walks around when he's, during the day, he walks around in the parks and sits on the benches and looks around for anything he could find. But he's not a sad person. He is who he is. And so Federico was always good to visit, and we chatted about different things. When I went with the Labre group, they're the high school boys. And so that he usually talked about sports. And sometimes he'd hang out at the gate down by the stadium. Most of the time, these are men, but sometimes there's women. Okay, and there's a little lady named Selena, a very bouncy lady. And it was always a pleasure to talk to her. And she would tell us everything she'd been doing during the week. And it was just an interesting thing to see Selena and a couple of her friends that they were staying together. All right. And so you just never know, because everybody is so different. And there's one gentleman who we would meet him, and he was with a group of others, and we'd be talking. And then he'd say, "Can we pray together?" And so everybody gathered around and bowed their heads, and he prayed. And you think, wow, you don't know what's going on in people's hearts. And he was a beautiful person, thanking God for all the good things that he had, which was very little. And so we can learn a lot from people like this. Sometimes we have so much and we don't realize all this goodness that we have. And how can it be shared with these people? Well, in many ways, we can send them a bag of food. That's what we do on Sunday nights. But importantly is we can pray for them, who are very loving people and in much need, sometimes physically, sometimes mentally, and sometimes spiritually. But it's interesting how they can give us the spirituality that they've gotten from the needs that they have. And so they're more than just people. They're more than just somebody passing on the street, but they are somebody that part of God's family, and God loves all of us, including all of them.
My name is Sister Mary Lewis Ann Green. Try to omit the ums as much as I can. First of all, let me thank you for thinking of doing this. And I want to especially thank Sister Rosanna for sharing her knowledge of Labre with me. Now, Anne asked me to talk about how I got started and anything I wish to share. So I'll do the best I can. And we're timing this so I don't go over time, because once you start talking about Labre, it's hard to stop. And that comes from a true story. When I was stationed at St. Procop's, which is now a parish closed in Cleveland, I was asked to minister to the poor, to the homeless, not the homeless, I'm sorry, to the homebound and those in the hospital. So I did that. And at the same time, Mike Grogan was also volunteering at St. Procop's. He had charge of the meal program. Now, St. Procop's provided meals once a week to the homeless of the neighborhood. Anybody could come. And when Procop's closed, Sister Annette Treese, the parish coordinator, had that money in that fund given to Mike Grogan, which he could take to St. Augustine's, they had a wonderful outreach program for the poor, a meal program. So that was done. But anyway, in our conversation together, Mike told me about Labre. Now, Mike, I knew sort of from grade school because I went to school with his brother, Ken. And Mike was 2 years older than I was, but I didn't know him when I was in grade school. Anyway, Mike was telling me about Labre. And believe me, once he started telling about Labre, I became immediately interested in it. He said it's a mission that whereby the people go out and visit the poor. They make friendships among them and with them. And it began with me in 2009, my last year at St. Procop's. And he was telling me about it. And I became, as I said, became very much interested. When we went out, we would get out of the van and greet the people And it was very important that we told them our name and asked them their name and repeated it. It's very important to know a person's name. So that was very much a mark of this whole ministry, is relationship with the poor. They weren't poor, they're our brothers and sisters, literally. So that was my first night at Libre. And I believe I was on the Flats route. I think I was. And that's the area where they go along the Cuyahoga. The people are underneath the bridges. And here's an example right here. I don't know if you can see it or not. This was a photo. It's a magnetic piece. I have it in my medicine chest. And it shows many of the students. And in the middle, next to me, is, I think his name is Kurt. And next to him is, I think his name is the Gipper. If not, one thing about the homeless, many of them give themselves special names, remaining anonymous. But whatever name they have, we call them by that name. Anyway, that's one of the pictures. And you see underneath is a quotation from the prayer of St. Joseph Benedict Labre. It says, this is part of it: show us how to befriend them, meaning the poor, and not pass them by. And that's exactly what they do. They befriend them. And that's a very important element. Remembering their name, saying their name, and keeping them in prayer. Now, one of the fellows I'm going to tell you about, we called him Alabama Jim. How did he get that name? I think he got it when he was stationed in Alabama, when he was in the service. And after he got out of the service, I believe, he got into drinking. He wasn't Irish, I don't think. Anyway, he became homeless as a result of his drinking, and his family did not know where he was. But one day, at the corner of one of the city streets in Cleveland, he had a religious experience. And from that day onward, he never had a drink. He had his place where he lived was off Denison Avenue. It was in a wooded area. It was near a railroad track there. And he built a cabin there. And even he had a window that opened up in his cabin, so he could open it up and feed the deer. They would come up to the window and he'd feed them. And anybody that needed help or needed lodging, he would let them to stay there, and he would feed them. And he had a stove in his cabin. He was very, very clever. This stove was the chassis of a car, and that was his stove. And he could put a whole part of a tree in there to warm the place. So that was Alabama Jim. Now, when Alabama Jim probably maybe a couple of years after I first met him, I was told that he was in an apartment, and he wasn't very long in the apartment before he died. But before he died, his family did reconnect with him, and they invited him to come home, but he said no, he could help more people if he stayed where he was until he couldn't stay there anymore. But then when he died, it was one of the largest funerals I ever went to, besides Jim's girls. He was raked and buried from a church in Valley View underneath the bridge, the Valley View Bridge. That was where the little church was. And during the wake service, one of the Labre men from John Carroll, who had known Alabama Jim, told the story about him and his experience with Jim. And he said, you know, Alabama Jim was not homeless. He was houseless, but he wasn't homeless. He made his home available to everybody. And so meeting people like that, how can you not love the poor in this mission?
Thank you to Sister Lisa McGaffin, Sister Rosanna Mellert, and Sister Louis Ann Breen for sharing some great information and touching stories about their ministry with their friends who happen to be homeless. In each region of the province, many sisters and associates are working with those who are experiencing homelessness. And we also recognize that many sisters and associates have ministered in the past with these folks. We would like to leave you with a call to action. During the last 3 weeks of Lent, roughly March 26th to April 13th, the JPIC office will help support the projects that have been planned in each area. This focus of reaching out to the homeless together will offer you an opportunity to serve in some way. You will receive information from your community coordinator about what is happening in your region so that you can be part of ministering to those who may live on the streets but are still part of our communities. Thank you for taking time to view this video, and let us keep one another in prayer as we continue to share God's goodness and provident care with all those we encounter.